Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Saturday, August 30th, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, an appeals court has ruled that most of Trump's tariffs are illegal. Plus, should taxpayer money protect private schools from shootings? And what economists are saying about Fed rate cuts. The divided U.S. appeals court ruled yesterday that most of President Donald Trump's tariffs are illegal. The court allowed the tariffs to remain in place through mid-October to give the Trump administration a chance to file an appeal with the Supreme Court. Trump called out the decision by what he said was a highly partisan court. He posted on Truth Social, writing that if these tariffs ever went away, it would be a total disaster for the country. The 7-4 decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington, D.C., addressed the legality of what Trump called reciprocal tariffs imposed in April and a separate set of tariffs imposed in February against China, Canada, and Mexico. The court's decision yesterday does not impact tariffs issued under other legal authority, like Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. Years before this week's shooting in Minnesota, Catholic schools in the state asked for more safety funding. But should taxpayer money protect private schools from shootings? I spoke with USA Today's Zach Shermley for more. Hello, Zach.
Hi, Taylor. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me in this tough week for Minnesota and the nation. How did some in the city push for additional state funding to keep their campuses safe, even long before this devastating shooting we saw in Minneapolis?
Years before this tragic shooting, it was actually in 2023 that advocates for non-public schools and religious schools were pushing the state legislature, and in particular, Governor Tim Walz, the Democratic governor of Minnesota, to help them garner support for help with a particular proposal that was going through the state legislature that would have provided additional funding for schools for security measures. And as that program was written in the legislation at the time, it did not include eligibility for non-public schools like Catholic schools. Advocates urged Tim Walz to help them lobby the state legislature to include religious schools in the newly proposed school safety program, but that law actually never passed.
So, Zach, why did they never get it? And what have we heard from lawmakers, I guess, in the city or state about this?
Yeah, it's not entirely clear why that law didn't pass, but the state legislature has been reconsidering it in 2025. But also, I think it's important to remember that there are different types of funding that public schools and private schools can be eligible for in order to ensure that they are securing their campuses in one form or another. There are certain forms of federal grants that private schools and nonprofit organizations in general can apply for in order to make their campuses safer. Like I said, lawmakers reintroduced that particular piece of legislation this year. So we'll see whether or not it has any sort of momentum, particularly given the recent tragedy in Minneapolis.
Well, Zach, the idea of investing public money in non-public schools, particularly religious ones, often stokes controversy, as you write here in the piece. How so? Can you talk through that a bit?
Yeah, the idea of investing public money in non-public schools, especially religious schools, stokes controversy all the time from Democrats and from public school advocates. But, we have to acknowledge that in 2025 in America, no school, public or private, seems to be entirely free from the risk of a shooting. And that fact is what has prompted some private school leaders, like the ones in Minneapolis and Minnesota more broadly, to push for security resources on par with their public school counterparts. And it's important to note, too, that there are cities and states that have moved forward with proposals to allow more private school security through taxpayer money. New York City is one that comes to mind. Eric Adams, the Democratic mayor of New York City, recently expanded a program that allows exactly that in New York City public schools and in private schools as well.
USA Today's Zach Shermley. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, Taylor.
The Trump administration is making plans for an immigration crackdown in Chicago, according to multiple news outlets. CNN and the New York Times both reported this week that a major operation could arrive in the city as soon as next week, citing unnamed administration sources. It could involve as many as 200 Department of Homeland Security officials, armored vehicles, and the use of a naval base outside the city as a staging area, the outlets reported. Chicago's violent crime is reportedly down 22% compared to the same period a year ago. The Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement did not respond directly to USA Today's request for comment on a planned Chicago operation. Both emailed a statement generally supporting Trump's broader immigration crackdown. You can read more with a link in today's show notes. It's clear President Trump wants Fed rate cuts, but what do economists say? I spoke with USA Today Money reporter Bailey Schultz to learn more. Hello, Bailey.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for hopping on. So let's just refresh things here. What's the latest on Trump's feud with the Fed?
Yeah, so we have seen sort of this long badgering by Trump, pressuring the Federal Reserve to drop interest rates. There was a lot of name calling with Fed Chair Powell. There were threats to fire Powell. He has since backed away from those threats with Powell, but the latest in this sort of feud happened earlier this week when Trump announced that he was firing Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook and pointing to accusations that Cook had made false statements on mortgage agreements. Cook is challenging this move in court, and so we'll have to see how things play out.
And Bailey, just help us understand what issues Trump has specifically with how the Fed is going about rate cuts.
The Fed has held interest rates steady since late 2024, and that's just because inflation has remained above the Fed's 2% target. The Fed really wanted to wait and see how tariffs played out and impacted consumer prices before making any moves on those rates and lowering them further. And the reason behind that is the Fed really has this dual mandate, these two goals that it keeps front of mind. One of those is to keep inflation low. The other is to keep employment rates high. So when we see inflation is running pretty hot, the Fed can either raise rates or kind of keep them steady, keep them higher to just hopefully slow economic activity a little bit and get that inflation under wraps. But Trump, he said that he doesn't believe there is any inflation or no inflation to worry about, so that is an issue, and has been asking the Fed to lower these rates, lower them aggressively, dramatically, in part because he says this would help lower mortgage rates, is an argument that we've been hearing a lot from him recently.
All right, good outline. So, Bailey, should the Fed cut rates now then, as Trump wants? What do economists say on this?
So yes and no on that. There is definitely a case for rate cuts now. We saw the most recent jobs report numbers pretty weak. We saw some cracks in some of the jobs numbers this year based on that report. And so we are seeing Powell sort of signaling that the Fed is more open to rate cuts, possibly during its next meeting this September. Powell just notes that the downside risk to employment is rising, even if inflation remains somewhat elevated, is what he said. But what we're hearing from Trump is an ask for pretty aggressive rate cuts. On Truth Social, he's asked for a 3-point drop. He's asked for rates as low as 1%. And to put that in context, the Fed's key interest rate range right now is 4.25 to 4.5%. So he's asking for much lower rates than what we see today. So I think the concern that some experts have on this is just the rates, the aggressive nature of these sort of cuts that we are hearing asked for at this moment. So the concern there is that if rates drop too quickly, if we see sort of dramatic rate cuts to that degree, that could have certain investors questioning the Fed's independence, growing more concerned over inflation. If we see that, investors would likely demand higher rates when they're lending the government money just to offset that sort of potential future inflation spike. That in turn, ironically, would end up driving things like mortgage rates, long-term borrowing rates even higher for consumers.
All right. Bailey Schultz covers money for USA Today. I appreciate the breakdown as always, Bailey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The sports calendar heats up this weekend as college football returns in full force, and things start off with a bang, featuring some top 10 matchups, including Texas traveling to Ohio State and LSU heads to Clemson, before Notre Dame heads to Florida to take on Miami tomorrow. You can check out some of our experts' picks from USA Today Sports with a link in today's show notes. And in tennis, the U.S. Open continues this weekend in New York with the third round in both men's and women's singles. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall in Louisiana, roughly 50 miles southeast of New Orleans. A catastrophic storm surge followed that led to breached levees, deadly flooding, and unimaginable devastation. 20 years later, USA Today went back to speak with some of the stewards of its rich cultural traditions, people like Ben Jaffe, creative director for the landmark music venue Preservation Hall.
For any New Orleans native, it's always a moment of conflict to leave or to stay. If you leave, there's a feeling of abandonment, that you're abandoning this place that you love, and if you stay, you're putting yourself and your family at risk.
Ben Jaffe's story of courage, resilience, and above all, hope is the focus of tomorrow's episode. You can listen right here on this feed beginning at 5 a.m. Eastern Time. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio, and you can email us at podcasts@usatoday.com. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back Monday with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.